My father raised his glass and thanked everyone for celebrating the moment he'd been waiting for, becoming a grandfather. I was standing 3 steps away, holding his first grandchild in my arms. Then he smiled at me and asked, "So, when will it finally be your turn?" The backyard looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine. Perfectly trimmed grass, white folding chairs arranged in neat rows, soft music drifting from hidden speakers, string lights hung between the trees, glowing gently in the late afternoon sun. Everything about the setting said celebration. I stood near the edge of it all, gently rocking my daughter Sophie in my arms. She was 7 months old, warm and solid against my chest, her small fingers curled into the fabric of my dress. She smelled faintly of baby lotion and sunshine. Every now and then she let out a quiet sound, not quite a babble, not quite a laugh, just a reminder that she was there, that she was real. Around me, relatives laughed and chatted in small clusters. Plates clinked, glasses were refilled, conversations floated through the air about baby names, nursery colors, and how fast time flies. The word baby was everywhere, just not my baby. My sister Lauren stood near the center of the yard, effortlessly radiant. One hand rested on her belly, the other wrapped around a glass of sparkling water. People gravitated toward her naturally, like she was the sun, and we were all just planets orbiting her light. Every few minutes, someone new leaned in to hug her, to congratulate her, to tell her how exciting this moment was. I watched her smile, nod, laugh at all the right moments. I had no anger toward her in that moment, just a quiet distance, the kind that builds slowly over time until you barely notice it's there. My husband Daniel stood beside me, his hand occasionally brushing against my back, a silent check-in. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We had already learned how to communicate in these spaces without words. "Do you want to sit?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "I'm okay." Sophie shifted, pressing her cheek against my collarbone. I adjusted my grip instinctively, the way parents do without thinking. It amazed me how natural it felt now, how something that once seemed terrifying had become second nature. Across the yard, my father Richard laughed loudly at something someone said. His voice carried easily, confident and familiar. He looked relaxed, proud, completely at home in this moment. I wondered, not for the first time, if he noticed me standing there. Not in a dramatic way, not with resentment, just noticed. A breeze passed through the yard, stirring the string lights and rustling the leaves overhead. Someone tapped a spoon against a glass. Conversations faded into expectant quiet. My father stepped forward. He cleared his throat, smiling as he looked around at the gathered family and friends. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "It really means a lot to us." People leaned in, attentive. Phones came out, cameras ready. He spoke about family, about legacy, about how life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. His voice softened when he talked about becoming a grandfather, about how long he had imagined this moment. I watched faces around me light up. I watched my sister wipe at the corner of her eye, smiling. I looked down at Sophie again. She blinked up at me, completely unconcerned with speeches or expectations. Her world was simple, safe. For now. As my father continued, something settled quietly in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Something heavier and harder to name. It was the feeling of standing in a room full of people who loved family, and realizing that somehow, without intending to, they had overlooked one. I shifted my weight, the grass cool beneath my shoes. Sophie let out a soft sound, and I gently bounced her, humming under my breath. The speech went on, warm and heartfelt, filled with hope for the future. No one interrupted. No one questioned anything. From the outside, it was a perfect afternoon, a perfect gathering, a perfect celebration of what was coming next. From where I stood, it felt like something had already happened, and no one noticed it had passed. I didn't know then that this moment would change everything. I only knew that I was holding my daughter in my arms, standing quietly at the edge of my own family's story, wondering how something so important could feel so unseen. The spoon tapped the glass again, sharper this time, and the last few murmurs faded. My father smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. He held his drink a little higher, as if the moment itself deserved elevation. He finished his thought about family and dreams, then let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they think they're about to say something charming. His eyes scanned the yard, and then they landed on me. "For years," he said warmly, "I've wondered when this day would finally come." He gestured toward Lauren, then paused. "When I'd get to be a grandfather." A ripple of approving smiles moved through the crowd. Then he turned his body slightly, angling himself in my direction. His tone stayed light, casual, almost playful. "So Emily," he said, smiling, "when will it be your turn?" The question wasn't cruel, that was the problem. It was asked with ease, like the answer was obvious, like it was harmless, like it couldn't possibly carry weight. But the moment it left his mouth, something shifted. The backyard went still. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that I felt it before I fully understood it. Conversations paused. Someone lowered their phone. A few heads tilted, waiting for my response. Daniel's hand found mine without looking. Sophie chose that moment to squirm, her small body pushing against my arm. I adjusted my hold automatically, pressing her closer to me. Her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I looked at my father. He was still smiling, still relaxed, completely unaware that he had just opened a door he didn't realize existed. For a split second, instinct kicked in. The instinct to laugh it off, to say something vague, to protect the moment for everyone else. I had done that my whole life. I could have said, "Oh, someday." I could have said, "We'll see." I could have redirected the attention back to Lauren, where it clearly belonged. No one would have questioned it. But standing there, holding my daughter, something inside me hesitated. I looked around the yard again, at the people who mattered, at the faces that had watched me grow up, at the family who believed they were witnessing the beginning of something. And I realized they had missed the middle. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. There was no rush of anger, no urge to defend myself, just a quiet, steady awareness that if I didn't speak now, I probably never would. I took a breath. The kind you take before stepping into cold water. The kind that prepares you even when you don't know exactly what's coming next. My father's smile faltered just slightly, as if he sensed the pause was lasting longer than expected. I glanced down at Sophie one more time. She stared back at me with wide, curious eyes, blissfully unaware of the moment she was standing at the center of. Then I looked up. "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words with care, "I think there might be some confusion." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. Lauren's smile froze, just for a moment before settling back into place. My father lowered his glass a fraction. "What do you mean?" The question wasn't defensive. It was puzzled. And that was when I understood something important. This wasn't a confrontation waiting to happen. It was a misunderstanding that had grown roots. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "It already happened." Silence spread through the yard, thicker this time. Not uncomfortable yet, just uncertain. My father blinked, once, twice. "What do you mean it happened?" he asked. I shifted Sophie slightly higher on my hip, feeling her weight, her warmth, her undeniable presence. I said gently, "I became a mother months ago." The words hung there, suspended between us. No accusations, no explanations yet, just the truth spoken plainly. Faces around the yard changed. Confusion, surprise, curiosity. A few people glanced from me to my baby, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. My father looked at Sophie, really looked at her, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence wasn't hostile. It was disoriented, like the room had skipped a beat and everyone was waiting for the rhythm to return. My father's gaze stayed on Sophie. Not just a polite glance this time, but a careful, searching look, as if he were trying to place her in a story that suddenly felt incomplete. "Months ago," he repeated slowly. I nodded. "Yes," I said, 7 months. A murmur rippled through the yard. Soft, restrained, uncertain. Someone near the back whispered, "I didn't know." Another voice answered just as quietly, "Neither did I." I didn't rush to fill the space. For once I let the silence work. Lauren shifted where she stood. Her smile returned, but it looked different now, tighter, less effortless. She laughed lightly, a sound meant to ease the tension. "Oh," she said, waving a hand as if this were a simple misunderstanding. "You know how Emily is. She's always been very private." A few people nodded, relieved to be given an explanation. I didn't respond right away. I looked at my father again. He wasn't listening to Lauren. His attention hadn't moved from Sophie. His brows drew together, confusion slowly giving way to something else. Something heavier. "Emily," he said carefully, "why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't accusing. It sounded genuinely confused, and that mattered. "I did," I said. The words came out quietly but clearly. "I told you when she was born. I sent photos. I invited you to meet her." I paused, choosing my next words with care. "I thought you knew." My father's mouth opened, then closed again. He shook his head slightly, like someone trying to clear fog from their vision. "No," he said. "I would remember that." "I know," I replied. "That's why this has been so hard to understand." Daniel squeezed my hand once, a steady pressure. Support, without interruption. Around us, people were starting to really look now, not just at Sophie, but at me, at the way I held her, at how natural it all was, how practiced. This wasn't a brand new reality. It was one that had been lived quietly for months. My father took a step closer. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Sophie. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated for half a second, not out of anger, but out of instinct. Then I nodded. "Of course." I adjusted Sophie in my arms and gently placed her into his. He held her awkwardly at first, like someone rediscovering a language they hadn't spoken in years. Then Sophie did what she always did. She reached up and grabbed his finger with surprising strength. A soft sound escaped his chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. He stopped, searching for the word. "She's beautiful." "Her name is Sophie," I said. He repeated it under his breath like he didn't want to forget. Sophie. The yard felt different now. The celebration energy had shifted into something quieter, more fragile. Conversation stayed hushed. No one reached for another drink. My father looked at me, his eyes glossy but focused. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I don't understand how I missed this." "I don't think anyone meant to miss it," I replied. "I think things just didn't reach where they were supposed to." I kept my voice neutral, factual. I wasn't there to assign blame. But the truth was already doing its work. Lauren stepped forward, her voice light again. "Dad, this isn't really the time." He held up a hand gently but firmly. "Just a minute," he said. That alone sent another ripple through the crowd. He looked back down at Sophie, rocking her slightly without realizing it. She stared up at him, curious, unimpressed, perfectly content. 7 months of firsts had passed without him. I saw the realization land, not all at once, but piece by piece, and I knew this was only the beginning. People didn't rush in with questions right away. They watched instead. Watch my father holding Sophie. Watch the way she settled against him like she'd done it 100 times before. Watch the quiet exchange of looks between me and Daniel. It was becoming harder to pretend this was a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. My father was the first to speak again. "Emily," he said softly, "why didn't I hear about any of this?" I took a breath. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be precise. "I thought you had," I said. "That's the honest truth." I explained slowly, carefully, that when Sophie was born, I had sent messages, that I'd shared photos, that I'd mentioned dates when we could visit, times when we'd be home, moments I assumed would naturally bring us together. I didn't make a big announcement, I admitted, but I didn't hide her either. My father frowned, processing. "I don't remember any of that." "I know," I said again. That's what confused me. I could feel eyes on us now. Not the curious kind, but the attentive kind. People were listening, not for drama, but for understanding. I continued, still calm. "There were times I thought maybe you were busy or traveling, or that life had just gotten in the way, so I waited. I didn't want to push." That part was hard to say out loud. Waiting had felt polite at first, respectful. Over time, it had started to feel like shrinking. I told them about invitations that never seemed to lead anywhere, about plans that stayed tentative until they quietly disappeared, about family events I found out about after they'd already happened. I assumed I'd missed the message, I said, or that I'd misunderstood. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the front pressed their lips together as if replaying old conversations in their head. My father's expression darkened, not with anger, but with regret. "I would never choose not to know my grandchild," he said. "I believe you," I replied. That was the truth. This wasn't about intent, it was about outcome. Lauren stood a little straighter beside us, arms folded loosely now. She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Emily's always been independent," she said lightly. "We all thought she wanted space." I didn't look at her. I kept my focus on my father. "I never asked for distance," I said, my voice still steady. "I just assumed everyone knew what was happening." Silence settled again, heavier than before. Sophie let out a small sound and my father smiled down at her instinctively, bouncing her slightly. The normalcy of it made the situation feel even more surreal. "I missed her first months," he said quietly, almost to himself. No one corrected him, no one minimized it. I could see the realization forming, not just in him, but in others too. That something important had been happening quietly, off to the side, while attention was focused elsewhere. I wasn't there to convince anyone of anything. I was there to make one thing clear. My daughter existed, she always had, and somehow, without anyone intending it, she'd been left out of the story. After that afternoon, I couldn't stop replaying moments from the past year in my mind. Not in a dramatic way, more like lining them up quietly, one by one, and seeing them for what they were. There had been family dinners I heard about afterward, casual mentions dropped into conversation like afterthoughts. "Oh, you weren't there. I thought you were busy." There were weekends when my phone stayed silent, weeks when I assumed everyone was just wrapped up in their own lives. I told myself that adulthood was like that, messy, uncoordinated, no one's fault. When Sophie was still tiny, when leaving the house felt like planning a military operation, I waited for someone to say, "When can we come by?" They didn't. So I waited longer. I remembered sitting on the couch late at night, Sophie asleep on my chest, scrolling through photos on my phone, pictures I'd sent, messages I'd written and rewritten before hitting send. I remembered telling Daniel, "They'll reach out when things slow down." He never argued with me, but he didn't fully agree either. "There's a difference between giving space," he'd said once carefully, "and disappearing." At the time, I brushed it off. Looking back now, I realized how often I'd explain things away, how quick I was to assume responsibility for gaps that weren't entirely mine. I thought about the times plans were suggested, then quietly dissolved. The visits that stayed vague, the calls that never quite connected. None of it had seemed alarming on its own. Together, though, they formed something unmistakable, a pattern. Standing in that backyard, watching my father hold Sophie, the weight of it settled in my chest. Not his anger, but his clarity. I hadn't been imagining things. I hadn't been too sensitive. I had simply been absent from conversations I didn't know were happening. "I should have asked more questions," my father said later, his voice low. "I should have noticed." I didn't correct him. This wasn't about what should have happened. It was about what did. I looked around at the familiar faces, relatives who had known me my entire life, people who cared, who showed up, who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. I could see it in their expressions now, realization mixed with discomfort. Someone finally spoke up. "Emily, I honestly thought you wanted time to yourself." Another voice followed. "That's what we were told." I nodded slowly. "I understand how that could happen," I said, and I meant it. "I just wish someone had checked." The words landed gently, but they landed. Sophie fussed, and my father handed her back to me reluctantly, like he wasn't ready to let go yet. I took her, settling her against my shoulder, her familiar weight instantly calming both of us. As I held her, something shifted inside me. I realized how easy it had been to stay quiet, to stay agreeable, to assume that being understanding was the same as being seen. But I also realized something else. If I kept explaining things away, if I kept minimizing my own presence to make others comfortable, my daughter would grow up learning the same habit. and that wasn't something I was willing to pass on. This wasn't about revisiting the past. It was about recognizing it, because patterns don't change unless someone is willing to name them. And for the first time, I was ready to stop pretending I hadn't noticed. Clarity has a strange side effect. Once you see something clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. In the days after the gathering, small moments began resurfacing in my mind, not emotionally, but practically. Details I'd once brushed past without question now stood out with sharp edges. There were messages I was sure I had sent, not dramatic announcements, just simple notes, photos, updates, little bridges meant to connect one moment to the next. I remembered checking my phone afterward, waiting for replies that never came, then convincing myself it wasn't personal. Everyone's busy, I'd told myself. Life gets loud. I hadn't gone searching for answers back then. I didn't want to be someone who demanded attention. I didn't want to create tension where none was intended. But now, the silence felt different. I started noticing gaps, not accusations, just gaps. A conversation that seemed to skip chapters. A reaction that didn't match the information I knew had been shared. A casual comment that suggested a version of me I didn't recognize. She likes her space. She's probably overwhelmed. She didn't want to make a big deal. None of those statements were cruel. That was what made them effective. They sounded reasonable, protective even, but they weren't mine. One evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone beside me, scrolling slowly. Old messages, old photos, dates and timestamps lining up quietly without commentary. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't preparing a confrontation. I was just trying to understand how something so significant could have slipped through unnoticed. Daniel watched me from across the table. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said. "I just didn't realize how much I'd filled in the blanks for other people." He nodded. "You always assume good intentions." "I still do," I replied, and I meant it. "I just don't want to assume absence anymore." That was the uncomfortable part. Realizing how often I had made myself smaller to keep things smooth. How often I had accepted explanations without checking whether they reflected reality. There were no dramatic revelations, no single moment where everything snapped into focus. Just a quiet accumulation of understanding. Information hadn't flowed the way I thought it had. Voices had been interpreted for me. Silence had been mistaken for choice. None of that required villains. It only required distance and assumptions to do their work. What unsettled me most wasn't what I discovered. It was how long I'd been willing not to look. I realized then that the hardest truths aren't explosive. They're subtle. They sit patiently, waiting for you to stop explaining them away. And once you do, they ask something of you. Not anger, not revenge. Responsibility. Responsibility to speak clearly, to show up fully, to make sure the people you love don't disappear quietly just because you stayed polite. Holding Sophie later that night, listening to her breathe, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just absence with good manners. I didn't plan a speech. There was no outline, no prepared explanation waiting to be delivered. What I did have was a decision I hadn't made before. I wasn't going to soften the truth to make it easier for everyone else. Not sharper, just clearer. The next time we were all together, the energy felt different. Quieter, more cautious. People smiled, but their smiles paused, like they were waiting to see what would happen next. I could feel it in the way conversations stalled when I walked into a room, in the way questions were carefully worded, as if everyone was afraid of stepping on something fragile. My father sat across from me, Sophie on his lap again. He'd taken to holding her whenever he could, as if afraid the opportunity might disappear. He watched her intently, memorizing details he'd missed the first time around. At one point, he looked up at me and said, "I want to understand." So I spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally. I told the story the way I had lived it. From my point of view, no commentary, no conclusions drawn for anyone else. I shared updates, I said. I waited for responses. When they didn't come, I assumed timing was bad. I didn't push because I thought giving space was respectful. I paused, then added, "But space only works when everyone knows it's been asked for." No one interrupted. "I never said I wanted distance," I continued. I never asked to be left out. I just didn't know how to reinsert myself without feeling like I was asking for something I shouldn't have to ask for. That sentence surprised even me, because saying it out loud made it real. I looked around the room, not searching for agreement, just letting the words settle. Some people nodded slowly. Others stared at their hands. "I'm not blaming anyone," I said. "I just need it to be clear that this wasn't a choice I made." The room stayed quiet, but it was a listening kind of quiet. My father leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I thought I was respecting you," he admitted. "I thought you didn't want help." I met his eyes. I wanted connection. That was it. No accusations, no lists, no replaying every moment that hurt. Just the difference between assumption and truth. Sophie let out a small laugh then, the kind that bubbles up unexpectedly. It broke the tension in the room without erasing it. My father smiled at her, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not checking." The words didn't fix everything. I didn't expect them to. But they did something else. They acknowledged that what happened mattered. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't speaking into silence anymore. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic gasp, no sudden apology that wrapped everything up neatly. What happened instead was slower and somehow heavier. My father sat quietly with Sophie in his arms, rocking her without realizing he was doing it. His thumb brushed over the back of her tiny hand, the way people do when they're trying to memorize a feeling. "She's already so alert," he said softly. "She watches everything." I smiled faintly. "She always has." He nodded, still looking at her. "I missed that stage," he said. It wasn't a question, just a statement. No one rushed to reassure him. No one said, "You'll have plenty of time," because everyone in the room understood the truth of what he was saying. Time doesn't reset. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw something different in his expression. Not confusion, not defensiveness. Loss. "How many firsts?" he asked quietly. "How many did I miss?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I was trying to protect him, but because listing them would have turned the moment into something else. "Enough," I said finally. He closed his eyes for a second, absorbing that single word. When he opened them again, they were glassy, but steady. "I thought I'd know," he said. "I thought someone would tell me." "I thought so too," I replied. That was the moment it fully landed, not just for him, but for everyone watching. This wasn't about blame or intention. It was about a gap that no one had noticed until it was already wide. My father handed Sophie back to me reluctantly. She protested with a small sound, reaching after him, already comfortable enough to want him closer. That seemed to break something open. He stood up, rubbing his hands together slowly, like someone trying to warm them after being out in the cold. "I don't want to miss anymore," he said. "I don't care how awkward it is. I don't care how busy I am." He looked directly at me. "I need you to tell me, even if you think I already know." I nodded. "I can do that." And I meant it. But I also understood something new. It wasn't just about telling. It was about being heard. Around us, the room felt changed. Conversations resumed quietly, but they carried a different weight now. People were more careful with their words, more aware of what hadn't been said before. This wasn't a resolution. It was a reckoning. And as I held Sophie close, feeling her settle against me, I knew that whatever came next, whatever rebuilding needed to happen, would start from here. What followed wasn't loud. There were no confrontations in the driveway, no dramatic exits, no raised voices cutting through the evening air. The gathering slowly found its rhythm again, but it was a different rhythm now, quieter, more careful, like everyone was relearning the music. People came up to me in small moments, not all at once, not in a line. An aunt touched my arm and said, "I'm really glad you spoke up." A cousin smiled awkwardly and admitted, "I honestly thought you wanted to be left alone." Someone else simply said, "I didn't know," and let the words hang there. I accepted all of it without argument, because this wasn't about collecting apologies. It was about understanding how easily assumptions turn into reality when no one questions them. My father stayed close to Sophie for the rest of the afternoon, not hovering but present. He asked questions, simple ones: what she liked, what time she napped, whether she was sleeping through the night yet. Each question felt like a small step towards something he was trying to rebuild. Lauren was quieter. She didn't disappear, but she no longer occupied the center of the space the way she had earlier. Her laughter came less easily. When our eyes met, there was something unreadable there. Not anger exactly, but discomfort. The kind that comes when a familiar dynamic shifts and no one is sure what replaces it. I didn't approach her. I didn't avoid her either. This wasn't the moment for that conversation. Daniel stayed by my side, steady as always. Later, when Sophie grew tired and the sky began to soften into evening, he leaned in and whispered, "You did the right thing." I nodded, though part of me was still catching up to that truth. As we prepared to leave, my father walked us to the gate. He hesitated, then said, "Can we set a time to get together? Just us." "Yes," I said, "we can." It was a simple exchange, but it carried weight. Driving home, Sophie asleep in her car seat, I watched the familiar streets pass by and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Relief. Not because everything was fixed, but because everything was finally out in the open. I realized then that speaking up hadn't caused distance. It had revealed it. And sometimes, that's the only way anyone sees how far apart they've drifted. Some relationships felt closer by the end of the day. Some felt uncertain. A few felt permanently changed. But for the first time, none of it was happening in silence. And that, I knew, mattered more than comfort ever had. That night, after the house went quiet and Sophie was finally asleep, I sat on the edge of the couch with the lights dimmed low. The day replayed itself in fragments, not sharply, not painfully, just present. Daniel sat beside me, our shoulders touching. Neither of us spoke for a while. "I didn't plan for it to go like that," I said eventually. "I know," he replied. "That's why it mattered." I thought about that. For years, I had believed that keeping things smooth was the same as keeping them healthy, that if I stayed patient, understanding, and flexible, everything would sort itself out. I told myself that being low maintenance was a virtue. But somewhere along the way, low maintenance had turned into low visibility, and I hadn't noticed the difference until my daughter was nearly invisible too. The days that followed were different. Not magically better, not suddenly perfect, just different. My father called, not to apologize again, not to explain, but to ask ordinary questions. How Sophie was sleeping, what foods she liked, whether we were free on Sunday afternoon. Ordinary questions can be powerful. They showed effort without performance, presence without spectacle. I answered them honestly, without resentment, but also without cushioning the truth. When something didn't work, I said so. When I needed space, I named it. When I wanted connection, I didn't wait for someone to guess. That was the choice I made. Not to punish anyone, not to rewrite the past, but to stop disappearing quietly. Some relationships adjusted easily, others didn't. A few stayed distant, uncertain how to exist without the old assumptions holding them in place. I let that be what it was. I was done carrying the responsibility for everyone else's comfort. What mattered most was simple. When Sophie laughed, someone heard it. When she reached for someone, they reached back. When milestones came, they were shared, not assumed, not delayed, not lost. One afternoon, weeks later, my father watched her crawl across the living room floor, clumsy and determined. He laughed out loud, a sound full and unguarded. "I won't miss this again," he said. I believed him, not because of the words, but because of the way he was there. I knew then that honesty hadn't broken anything worth keeping. It had clarified what mattered. Families don't fall apart because of truth. They fall apart because of silence layered on top of silence, until no one remembers who stopped speaking first. I had chosen something different. I chose visibility over ease, clarity over assumption, and my child over my fear of discomfort. This story isn't about a single question at a backyard gathering. It's about the moment I realized that protecting the peace by staying quiet had a cost, and that cost was too high. So I spoke. And from that point on, neither my daughter nor I would ever be invisible again.